In the previous videos, we mentioned three important keywords in object-oriented development: components, classes, and objects. They all relate to each other, and we'll go over what they mean in more detail in this video. Components, or CF components, or CFCs, those are all the same thing. These are all the .cfc files in your code base, the actual files with the code in them. They describe what the things we're building will look like. Components can have whatever number of variables you want in them, and whatever number of functions you want too. Inside the components, variables are usually called properties, and functions are usually called methods. It's just an OO naming convention. They do the exact same thing as variables and functions that you're used to from procedural programming. The command you use to build a CF component is the word component, though you'll hear them described as classes pretty often too, because that's the commonly used phrase in most other OO languages. So we have our component or class that tells us what kind of properties we'll need to describe, say, an employee. Employees will have a first name, a last name, an age, a date they were hired, probably other things too. These are all the properties in your component or class. And of course, employees can do various things. They can get paid, they can go on vacation, and so on. These are the methods in your component. Let's take a step back for a second. We all know what an integer is, or an array, or a string, or a struct, right? These are all types of data, and we can make variables of those different types. I can make an integer that's called age, and another one called average speed, and a third one called height, or whatever. The three things would be variables, and they are of type integer. Or in CFML, more specifically, they'd be of type numeric, but you get the idea. Components work the same way. When I have an employee CFC file, that's the type of data we're making by itself. That's the employee.cfc file, and it doesn't actually live in memory or act as a variable yet. I have to create an instance of that employee component before I can use it. That instance of the component is called an object, and that is the actual variable that lives in memory, which we'll use in our application, just like we would any other variable. So here's our index.cfm file, and you can see at the top we've got two string variables, first name and last name, and I've got two dump statements afterward, so we can output the contents of those on the screen, and you can see here, they work just like any other variable you're used to from previous programming you've done. I'm going to go back here to my code and comment those out. We've seen that those work. That's just a starting point, as a point of reference, if you will. Now I'm going to make a musician component. Here's our musician CFC, and you can see it's a pretty simple component actually. It has two properties, first name and last name, and there's nothing else in it. Instead of just using variable name and an equal sign and then the value like I would for a non-component type variable, an integer or a string or something like that, I'm going to use this create object function that's baked into CFML. I tell it I want to create a thing called a component because you can create a few other things with the create object function besides components. So I say create object component, and then I just tell it the name of the .cfc file that I want to create an instance of in memory. Save that to my variable, obj musician. So this is my musician object, and I'm just going to dump that out to the screen with the right dump statement. Save, reload our page, and you can see we have a component of type musician being created for us. Nothing too crazy about that yet. Let's comment that one out, and we'll look at this code sample. Here I'm also creating a musician component. This line of code does the exact same thing as this line of code. The only difference is instead of using the create object function, I'm using the new keyword to create my musician component. In previous versions of CFML, create object was the traditional way most components got created. In more recent versions of CFML, the new construct was added. It cuts down on the typing you have to do, so you don't have to do create object component anymore. You just say new and put a set of parentheses after the component name. The other nice thing about doing it this way is using the new keyword is basically how all other OO languages create classes and objects in their code bases as well. So if you have to switch from CFML to Java or C++ or things like that, you'll use the new keyword in those languages too. So it's kind of a good habit to get into in CFML, to use new just like you would in any other language. And I'll save and reload that page, and you can see I get the exact same results here on the screen. It works the exact same way as the create object function does. Let's comment that out. Now we're going to create an instance of my actor CFC. Actor looks like this. You can see this one has no property tags at the top, but it's got some variables, scoped variables inside here. First name, last name, and age. We'll go over the differences in the variable scope and property tags later in this video series. But for now, you can see we've got a thing called init, and then we've got some other functions down here, get first name, set first name, and so on. It's not a terribly complicated component, but it does do a little bit more functionality than our musician one did in a previous example. One thing to note here is instead of just the open and close set of parentheses that we used for the musician object earlier, I'm now actually passing some data into that set of parentheses next to the name of my component. This sort of syntax here is doing what we call calling the constructor for the actor CFC. Here's my actor, here are the parameters being passed into it, and here in the CFC, I've got that init function we mentioned a minute ago. It's getting 3 arguments passed in, first name, last name, and it looks like an age that's just being abbreviated as A. It's being saved into a variable called age. Here on line 7, that's how I know it's an age. I've got 3 arguments being passed in here. Notice how I don't have anything saying .init or anything like that. The word init isn't actually visible here anywhere. That's sort of a side effect of how components were originally created in earlier versions of CFML. The way you build a constructor is you just basically have a function in your component named init, I-N-I-T. That's a reserved naming convention for building your constructor. And then here in your actual .cfm files where you use that component, you just pass those items in to the component name. That will automatically call this init method up here. We'll get into more detail about that in a future video, but I just want you to see the difference into what's happening here versus here, why we're passing arguments in, and why there's no function in here called actor, although it looks like we should be calling a function called actor from this syntax on line 14. So let's save that and reload it. And you can see here is our actor component, and you can see it has a little bit more involved output for us than the previous musician example. Here are the different methods available inside our actor component. I'll go in here, and now I'm going to turn on this second actor example. Now you can see I have 2 actor components, one being created on line 14 in a variable called act1, a second being created on line 17 in a variable called act2. These are the objects being created in memory. So I have one component or class, and I have 2 instances of that object. Those are both 2 objects in memory, or rather I should say these are 2 instances of that component being created, stored as objects. Go back here and reload the page, and you can see here is one actor component, and if I scroll down, there is our second actor component, 2 actor objects in memory in my CFML server. Now I can go down here, and I'm also going to create an instance of this employee component. And again, we're passing some arguments into the employee component, just like we did our actor one. We'll take a look at that here. In this case, we do have some property tags at the top. So remember, property tags are not required in a component. Sometimes you have just property tags, sometimes you have none at all, sometimes you'll have both property tags and functions. We'll get into all of that in a future video. But we also have that init function in here, which again acts as the constructor, and that's just the thing you can use to pass data into your component as it's being created. In this case, my employee component, I'm passing in Bill Gates and an age of 40. Those will go in here to these variables first, last, and my age. We're going to call some functions and do return this. We'll cover all of this stuff in future videos, so don't worry too much about those details right now. The main takeaway here is I can create instances of my actor component as objects, and I can create an instance of my employee component as an E1 object as well. I want to save that and reload it. You'll see here's our actor component, here's our second actor component, and down below that we have an employee component being created as well. I can of course go back in here and create my musician component along with that, reload. Here's our musician component that doesn't have anything in it. And here's our actor components and our employee component down below. Just so there's no confusion, this of course would work with the create object syntax as well. So I can mix and match create object with this new syntax if I want to. They both do the exact same thing. See, I save and reload the page. There's still my musician component using the create object style syntax. If you have a little bit of an older CFML code base, You might see the create object syntax used pretty regularly throughout it. That's a real common way components got created, maybe let's say 10 years ago or so in CFML space. In a little bit more recent versions of the language, people are generally shifting toward using the new syntax whenever possible. That doesn't work on every single CFML engine out there. You have to have a little bit more of a modern server. But again, if you are able to use that syntax, it's generally preferred. It's shorter, less typing, and it makes your code work much more similarly to how it would work in other OO languages like Java and C++. So here are some basic examples of how you create instances of components and how you can pass data into those components when they get created. We'll go over that syntax and concept more in a future video. For now, the main takeaway is just see the different ways you can create instances of components. Create object and new.